instills not necessarily a good fear, but like a negative fear, that's no good.
See, we've forgotten something, I think, maybe in the church sometime. It's supposed to be called the good news, not the bad news.
Yeah.
And there's too much. I think oftentimes there's a great focus on all of the bad news, but I want to tell you something. The Bible is a book with good news. Remember the angel said, I bring you glad tidings of great joy? That's the way it's supposed to be. Let me give you something else to just think about. We're talking about the Bible. The book of Romans, the 15th chapter and the 4th verse. Listen to this. Whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we, through patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. Think about that. They're given to us for our benefit, that through patience, which we Americans don't have much of that, but
No.
we need to think about the importance of that.
Yeah.
Somebody said great works of art, music, and literature have never been given to us by people out of breath. It takes time to develop the kind of hope that will secure us no matter what the circumstance.
And so let's just say that today a lot of struggles that Christians and non-Christians face. It's a lot of, I would guess, not negative, I'd just say more of a depressive mind state. A state of mind that's more so depressive. So you mentioned, did you mention the helmet of salvation?
I have not, but I'm anxious to get to that.
So go ahead and start on the helmet.
So it actually, it's interesting in the Bible, and this was a discovery to me that I made a few years ago. In one book of the Bible, it's referred to the helmet of salvation, which is accurate, Ephesians. You're familiar with that. But there is another reference in the book of 1 Thessalonians, and when you put that in perspective, the book of 1 Thessalonians was written to a group of young Christians that were in the midst of tremendous difficulties and struggles, false doctrine and teaching and preaching that needed to be corrected. They were facing a lot of challenges that we face today, and they were young. Listen to this verse. Let us, this is 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 8, let us who are of the day be sober, putting on the breastplate of faith and love, and for a helmet, the hope of salvation. For God has not appointed us to wrath, but to obtain salvation by our Lord Jesus Christ. Boy, that's some great news right there.
So when we were talking about this the other day, it was a newer revelation for me, understanding this hope of salvation, because I haven't really heard of it that way before.
Talking about the helmet being called the helmet of hope?
Yeah. And so I'm assuming this is probably also new for a lot of other people as well. Right. Not that I'm super smart or anything, but
well, it was new for me.
Yeah.
And I've been at this almost 60 years.
And so with the helmet of hope, is this just a hope that, since a lot of things people are facing nowadays are like depression and anxiety and a lot of mental issues, is this a hope that we're just not utilizing entirely?
That's exactly right. In fact, unfortunately, Christians and, of course, non-Christians live many of their days without wearing the helmet of hope. And if you think about this, in the days of the Romans, the most important piece of armor was the helmet, because a blow to the head would be fatal. That's why I believe that the Bible listed, and I'd never noticed that before, and I read the Bible all the time. But suddenly I saw, my goodness, the helmet of hope. Listen to this in another translation. Let us who live in the light keep sober, protected by the armor of faith and love, and wearing as our helmet the happy hope of salvation. In other words, it is possible in the midst of whatever's going on in the world to have happiness if you have on the helmet of hope. And I hope we can talk about it in a few minutes as to how you practically accomplish this.
Yeah. With hope, I guess people will wander around aimlessly. So is like hope more of like a guiding point that where people walk towards? Like this is like gives me a clear direction of where I need to go, or is it more of like a zealous kind of joyous state.
I think it's both of those, because I think if you have hope, it certainly has a lot to do with the direction of your life. If you feel that things are always going to be hopeless, you're going to have a state of despair, of desperation. We see that in our world so much today, and I think we need to discover that in the midst of all that's going on, it doesn't have to control your life.
So, for someone who may not know anything about the Bible, what is our hope based in? Like, what is our hope?
What is our hope? Of course, the answer to that, I can give you a short answer. We could get into a very lengthy answer, but I think that the epitome of hope is in the person of Jesus Christ. What he did for us when he was on this earth, what he has provided for us in our life today. He is our source of hope. But we have to we have to arm ourselves with the helmet of hope. That has to do with your mind, because the helmet covers your head. That's a somewhat of a spiritual illustration, that we arm ourselves with the helmet of hope on a daily basis. And we can talk about that a little bit here if you want to. How do we do that?
Sure, go ahead.
Well, as we put on the helmet of salvation every day, our minds. Now, let me tell you this. Hope has to do with the way you think. Believe it or not, some people deny this, you can control your thoughts. A bad thought can come in your head. You make a decision. Am I gonna embrace that? I remember an old country preacher used to say, you can't keep the buzzards from flying over your head, but you can keep them from landing in your hair. And when a bad thought comes, listen to this. As we wear the helmet of salvation every day, our minds become more insulated against the suggestions, desires, and traps that the enemy lays for us. We choose. It's a choice. Thank God we can make choices.
Yeah.
We can determine the quality of our life. We choose to guard our minds from excessive worldly influence. That's kind of a sophisticated way to say that you don't need to watch the news 24 hours a day. I've been a Christian a long time. I can't even watch it, but just a little bit.
Yeah.
You know, we choose to guard our minds from excessive worldly influence, and instead think on things that honor Christ. Let me give you a promise with that. This is an unchanging principle. In fact, it's in the Bible. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Wow. So what we think is very, very important. That word helmet is a powerful word. It means the protection. Let me give you a definition. This from the Greek word, it means the protection of the soul, which consists in the hope of salvation. Man is a triune being, spirit, soul, and body.
Yeah.
Your spirit is your God consciousness. Your soul is your self-consciousness. And your body is your world consciousness. The soul is the place where the mind resides. Your mind is a part of your soul. Your emotions and thoughts, that's all in the soul. That's why that it's so important that helmet is there. It protects and shields our mind.
I do want to go back to one thing you mentioned when you were talking about an excessive amount of worldly influence. I guess, how do we empirically measure that? Like, what is considered a lot of worldly influence in maybe today's terms? Like, is that me, for extreme example, is that me watching Fox or NBC for, every day, every evening, all day? Or is that me scrolling on social media way too much, or a large portion of my time? What does that look like?
I don't need to answer that. You just answered that. Think about that.
Yeah, yeah.
Think about that. What you feed on determines the kind of life and the kind of mindsets, and it affects your decisions and your relationships and everything else. I
guess the one reason why I wanted to bring it up
I'll
is
let
because,
you.
like,
I'll let you judge this before we go to that.
okay.
Have you ever been watching, let's just say, the news or social
No,
media?
I haven't, but yeah.
Or social media or Facebook or whatever.
Yeah.
And suddenly you feel this is too much. I've had enough of this. I need something that will change this scenery. You ever had that feeling?
Yeah.
Did you do anything with it?
At the time, probably not.
Right. No, we have an awareness when it's just like when you're eating. You really, I'm talking about physically eating. If you really are conscious of that, you know that next helping is not necessarily what you need. And you have to have the discipline to shift from that. Go ahead with the other statement there.
The reason I was mentioning is because, like, especially nowadays, we can't cut it out entirely because it's partially needed. Information and stuff. Yeah. So I'm like trying to figure out, how can someone measure, like, what's the line? Is it just like that feeling that you're saying, or is there like practical things that we can notice?
I think practical. I think I'm a very practical guy, and if it won't work on Monday, I'm not interested in talking about it on Sunday.
Yeah.
And so I think there are some practical guidelines. I think that we can actually, just like we do in our physical diet, I think we can do that also in our mental diet and determine and begin to experiment with, how much of this do I really need? What impact is this having on me? Do I need to reduce this? And I want to also say, I'm a firm believer in becoming informed. I'm doing my best to stay up with what's going on in the world, because I think it's important that I know those things. But I cannot allow those things to totally control my mind, because if I do, I'm going to become a little bit a victim of hopelessness. And we're going to talk about that in our talk here.
But it's hard, or how do I want to say this? It's too hard to think. So I'd rather just let media just tell me how to think. You know what I mean?
Well, you're creating a great opportunity for me to talk right here. That's what we need to address. Listen, social media, and hey, I thank God for all of the various methods of communication, because there's some positive needs, like in the present moment right here. The whole world is watching what's going on in Ukraine, and that's a good thing. Now, my heart goes out to the Ukrainians. I love the Ukrainians. I pray for them. I pray for those mothers and children that are being victimized by that. But at the same time, I need to stay informed, but I do not need to allow that to control my mind.
Yeah. And so when you say control your mind, you're meaning more of like a, I guess, would I say depressive state, or like a fearful state?
Both of those. And you mentioned something here. Perhaps the greatest enemy of a human being is fear. And unfortunately, the dark side knows that. And they seek to create elements of fear. We've got to make the decision. I am not going to be a victim of fear, because I have a source of hope. Now, let me give you this. This is very important for what we're talking about right here.
Okay.
We use the hope, pretty easily and so on, and it is a powerful word. My oldest daughter is the vice president, senior team lead for what is called the Mission of Hope in Haiti, poorest nation in this hemisphere. The Mission of Hope feeds 122,000 children a day.
Wow.
I would never say it if I had not seen it. But that's a great name, Mission of Hope. That's a powerful thought.
Yeah.
It's bringing hope to those children. Now, let me give you a definition. Hope, defined in the Greek language, actually means expectation of good, joyful and confident expectation of eternal salvation. That's why it's called in one place the helmet of salvation, the hope of salvation. Literally, you protect your mind, your emotions, and thoughts by wearing your helmet of salvation.
So if I'm getting this right, and of course you can feel free to correct me and all that, the hope that what we're basing our hope in is, like you said, Jesus, but like to be a little more concrete about it, it's basing in our life's endpoint and where we'll be. And like we know that it's a good place. We know we'll be going to heaven. That's where our hope is based in, or am I getting that wrong?
That is part of the truth. That is, of course, the ultimate truth. If you think about it, the Christian who really knows his Bible and has read the last pages of the Bible understands that ultimately the Christian never really dies. He rather graduates to a dimension of living that we've never imagined here on this earth. Some of the martyrs who were burned at the stake for their faith. I'm trying to remember his name, but one of them was burning at the stake, and his last words were, "For these ashes, I shall have pearls." You can't stop a person like that.
No.
The Apostle Paul, who was of course killed for his faith, he was a martyr. He said that for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But that doesn't mean that we dwell on I just can't wait to die.
Yeah.
I don't believe that's what that means.
That's a different conversation.
That's a totally different conversation.
Yeah.
But I think that what we need to understand is that even in this life, with the worst of circumstances, we are never without hope, because we have access to the source of hope, who answers our prayers and intervenes in our situation.
So I can imagine that hope would get hard in times where, you could say like world events like Ukraine, like for instance we mentioned, or even more individual time frames of persecution where you're getting either, I don't want to say hated on, but you're just getting persecuted for whatever reason. Those times hope can be harder to see. Is the Christian just supposed to toughen up, or how does that hope implement it and get us through those harder times?
Well, let's talk for a moment, if we may, about the battle that takes place in the helmet in each situation.
Okay.
Let's talk about for a moment a term that is used in the Bible. It's called strongholds. Everybody needs to understand, Christian and non-Christian, you and I have an enemy that wants to destroy us. I mean, that's an undeniable fact. And what he does, he builds in us, if we allow him to, a stronghold. And the stronghold becomes the beachhead in which he can inject things that destroy our hope. Listen to this passage in 2 Corinthians 10. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. Listen to this next phrase. Casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. In just a matter of seconds right here, I'm gonna endeavor to share with you and teach with the folks that are watching and hearing this how our enemy develops a mental stronghold in our mind. You simply read that last verse, 2 Corinthians 10:5, in reverse. You go to the reverse reading of that and you start out with a thought. A thought. Boy, we can talk about that. A thought. The next word you find coming backwards in the verse is you find imagination. And then ultimately you find a stronghold. So the way to avoid mental, emotional strongholds that disturb us, that create a feeling of despair and helplessness and hopelessness, is we start out by bringing into captivity those thoughts.
And what does that look like?
What does that look like? All right, that's a very good question. When I begin to entertain a thought that is contradictory to the biblical perspective on total well-being, and that's what the word salvation means. It means spirit, soul, and body being well and whole. And I detect that thought is contradictory to that. Instead of dwelling on that and letting that become an imagination, I begin to imagine, oh, this could be fatal. Oh, this may wreck my marriage. Oh, this may destroy my business. Those are familiar thoughts in our world.
Mm-hmm.
We bring that into captivity and instead replace that with what God in His Word says about that situation. And interestingly enough, the Bible addresses every situation that we face. Let me give you a quick example. Bitterness is a common thing that people have to deal with. But you can actually get rid of bitter thoughts if you are willing to do so. Because bitterness can contaminate everything around you. Mm-hmm. All of us have dealt with, unfortunately, bitter people. That's an example. It starts with taking captive that thought. Don't dwell there. Don't let that buzzard build a nest in your hair.
Mm-hmm.
Take charge of that, because if you don't, it can become an imagination. This can be. Let me give you just a simple illustration. You can begin to think that person there really doesn't like me. Next thing you know, they do something that
confirms it.
Yeah, you say, well, I told you that right there. I mean, they didn't even speak to me this morning.
Mm-hmm.
You suddenly are beginning to develop it's not true, but it's an imagination. And that eventually can become a stronghold that will affect your relationship with that person. That can even happen in a marriage.
Now, I'm assuming the goal is not to be rid of imagination. Or
No. In fact, let me just share something with you that I think is absolutely incredible when you think about this, and it's just so powerful when you really consider this. That there's a verse in the Bible, and you've got a church background, I think, yourself, and you probably heard maybe more preaching than you can remember or want to remember, but there is a verse in the Bible that says this: "He whose mind is stayed on the Lord, thou wilt keep him in perfect peace." How would you like to be kept? This is a question for all of us. How would you like to be kept in perfect peace? It has to do with your mind. Now, here's the interesting thing. This was a new discovery for me. The Bible's the most powerful book. You can read it and read it and read it. And one day you pick it up and read the same passage you read 70 times. And suddenly, my goodness, I never noticed that. The word mind, he whose mind is stayed on the Lord, that word is found 5 times in the Old Testament. And 4 of those times it is translated imagination. Now think about that. That God wants us to have an imagination that is fixed on Him and allowing Him to give us positive thoughts and dreams and visions. He whose imaginations are stayed on the Lord, thou wilt keep him in perfect peace. That's one of the things. That's a practical application right there. You can even ask yourself when you're facing a little situation where the thoughts are getting out of control, what do I need to be doing right now to think on things that will honor Christ? Very important. Positive. We think oftentimes, and the Bible uses the term of negative imaginations. I talked about it. But on the other side of the page, there are positive imaginations. Somebody has said it, and I think it's very, very, very important to understand this, that we fall victim to negative things, and we cast it around. That could never be done. We could never do that.
Yeah.
Now, you've never said that, but there are people that do say that. Somebody wrote something that I jotted down for this time here to just introduce for you to think about, and that is this: that hope is something that sees the invisible. Hope feels the intangible. Hope can achieve the impossible. The word impossible is slung around by people who really don't want to try to do something. Listen to me. Everything is impossible until somebody does it. Nobody could fly until the Wright brothers did it.
Yeah. So, are you saying hope is the fuel for doing the impossible? Or is it more so the imagination that's based in God that allows us to do the impossible?
The imagination enables you by faith. It's not hope that gets it done, but you're able to see it. You see it by faith. You see yourself as able to do this, and faith in God enables you to do it. It's why it's connected. You remember we talked about in 1 Corinthians 13, now abideth faith, hope, love. Boy, you get those three things working in your life's moving in the right direction. And just let me underscore this, that vision is so important. What you see, ultimately you can possess. And the great things that have been accomplished in the world have basically been done by people who saw it before anybody else.
Yeah.
And by faith, they were able to do it.
I'm just taking all this in and thinking, chewing on it, as I would like to say.
Good.
I guess where I want to go from here, there's one thing I heard the other day about imagination. And it kind of applies to more so today. We actually don't use our imagination as much anymore. Mostly because if there's an image or something we want to see, it's already there. It can be found really easily. And the only thing that really, and this is more of a secular view on imagination, but if we want to fuel our imagination, they say reading is one of the best ways to do it, because it's literally all unseen, not visually, and it just builds, I guess, fuel for your imagination. And so I was thinking, if we're trying to build an imagination that's based in God, is reading the Bible the only answer to that? I'm not trying to sound like, Bible punchy where I'm throwing Bibles at people, but is that like the one answer to building that kind of imagination?
Let me before I give you my straight out answer, I want to tell you something. My decision long ago, this was before you were born. I was a junior in high school, and I made a decision to read the Bible through every year. Now we think that, oh my goodness, how could I ever do that? It's going to shock you. You can actually do that in probably only about 10 to 15 minutes a day. Mm-hmm. And so I've been doing that since I was, and I changed translations to just kind of get a different perspective, but and that is an amazing thing. I've been doing this so long, and yet I look forward every morning to reading the Bible. Your introduction there regarding reading, that's the disease of this culture. We let everything else feed us instead of us feeding ourselves. You've heard the phrase that leaders are readers. You ever heard that?
I have.
That's important. And that is not only important, that is true. But there is also a tremendous amount, and you have to be careful here, but there's a tremendous amount of great literature and great books that have been written on particular subjects that will feed your soul. when you begin to feed on those. I was just looking here in this room. There's a number of books on the shelf right here. You should see my library. But
I'm young and poor, so I can't have a massive one.
But to answer your question, reading is so very, very important, and I would encourage every person to challenge that. And I'm a little concerned right now in our school system. We're facing a little bit of a crisis in that with our students, and I think we need to have somebody talk about it, think about it, and get reading back where it needs to be.
And I just want to clarify, when it comes to reading, it's not necessarily literally reading only. Like, because for me, I'm an extremely slow reader. That was my worst scores all throughout schooling. But I can listen to something and pretty much retain like upwards of 80 to 100% of it, versus reading. Like reading, it takes me a long time to read something. So I just want to clarify that reading, or I can look here, my camera's right here, I'm not used to that. Reading is also listening. Am I wrong to say that?
No, you're exactly right. And here's the thing about it. The amazing thing is that of course, the Bible right now is available in audio. I mean, some great audio versions of the Bible, and many of the great books have been placed on audio for many and sundry reasons. But no, you're exactly right. It's feeding. And whether you do it with your eyes or with your ears, it will accomplish the same purpose. And someone has said that actually what we hear, we retain more of it than what we see.
So I want to move forward. Not that any of this is a bad conversation. I think this is a lot, but I don't want to dive too further into it because it's a lot to chew on. I'm even getting, I don't want to say a headache. It's a lot of new things for me as well. So I can only imagine someone who doesn't know any of it.
Right.
I know we talked about before the podcast about the anchor of hope.
Yes.
Can you explain what this anchor of hope?
First of all, think about that term is actually in the Bible. I don't know if you knew that, but that term is actually in the Bible. And you think about what an anchor does. An anchor secures a boat in the midst of rough water and rough waves, and actually anchors have been the salvation of many boats being preserved from destruction. That is a term that is in the Bible, and the Bible puts a tremendous amount of weight on that. Listen to this in the book of Hebrews, chapter 6, that by two immutable things in which it was impossible for God to lie, we might have a strong consolation who have fled for refuge to lay hold on the hope set before us. Watch this verse. Which hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, which entereth into that within the veil, or literally into heaven. And what that means is that the hope, if we are people of hope and live in harmony with the helmet concept, that gives us an anchor that is connected to the source of hope, which is God Himself. I think that's one of the most important things to remember, that when you begin to recognize that God is a God of eternal hope. God never gives up on us. When I was not a Christian, God had hope for me. Boy, that's a great thought to think. But the anchor of hope is the security that we find. And listen to this. Regardless of what happens in our lives, God never gives up on us, and His plan and purpose for us, if we have a heart that's turned toward Him, will ultimately be accomplished. That's the anchor of hope. When we mess up, I don't know if you've ever messed up.
More than once.
Oh my goodness, have I messed up. But thank God that's why pencils have erasers, isn't it? I mean, we can back up and do this again. And one of the great promises is that even if we fail, even if we fall, one translation says it isn't fatal. Now that gives me hope when I mess it up. I mean, when I drop the ball big time, it isn't fatal. God reaches out and says, you can do this. I'm going to help you do that.
When we say fatal, are you referring just to bodily death, or are you talking more so like the soul, like a death of the soul, or what do you refer to as fatal?
When I refer to failure, I'm talking about whether it be failure in this world, if we fail to meet our commitment, or we fail to accomplish what we are supposed to accomplish, or we fail in our responsibilities as a parent, or as a husband or wife, or in business, or in ministry, in my case, in ministry, it's great to know that you get another chance. That's what it says. Though a good man, the Bible says, though a good man fall, I can't remember now how many times, but it's a large number. Yet, it says, he can get up and succeed.
Now, probably one of the not last questions, but one of the last few things I want to go and see if I make sure I'm understanding this anchor right. So the anchor of hope, this is kind of like what secures the hope to persevere with us when we face persecution or anything else. Because Christians nowadays, maybe some people like to make the argument that people are weaker nowadays. I don't like that argument, but people like to make that argument. And so a lot of people will come with, you just need to toughen up, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and maybe sometimes that is not the resolution, but the solution to some individual problems. But right. I don't want to say that's the main way to do that. I want to say that it's hope that will pull us through a lot of those things.
Yes. And
so this anchor, if I'm understanding this all correctly, this anchor of hope is what we can anchor ourselves in to get us through this. Am I saying that right?
You're exactly right. And in fact, you're just almost touching on my wife's, and she's a great woman, her favorite verse in the Bible. Her favorite verse. Now, I have to confess, I believe it because I believe the Bible, but it's not my favorite verse. Her favorite verse, and she quotes it to me 3 or 4 times a day, particularly if I whine a little bit. Her favorite verse is Romans 8:28, and we know that all things work together for good to those that love God and to those that are called according to his purpose. Doesn't say some things, says all things. What that does, if you really get a handle on that, is even the bad things that happen to us, and all of us experience good things and bad things, but even the bad things that happen, God is able to take that and work it for our good. And that gives me hope to get up and try again.
So, and this will be probably one of the last few things. What does the promises of hope, what does that look like in our everyday life?
That's a very, very good question. That's a very good question. I think this is what it looks like to me. That every day, I commit myself afresh to follow Jesus as best I can. Even if I make a mistake or I fail or I fall in that area, I think that God sees my heart and he gives me the strength to walk through that particular day with that helmet on and my anchor secure. That this day is going to be a day that I'm going to honor him. As a result of that, I have that hope in me that he is going to cause the events and circumstances and situations and relationships to ultimately honor him and glorify him, and that gives me hope.
So to circle back all the way to the very beginning, we'll readdress the main question of this entire podcast is, how do we face a hopeless future? Because Christians, of course, a lot of people can be hopeless, especially in today's climate.
I've been thinking a great deal about the title of this, and I think the answer to that is this. Number one, and you got to think about this, a Christian in today's world does not have a hopeless future. Because a Christian is committed to Christ, is a child of God, and with God, it is never a hopeless situation. So consequently, I remind myself on an ongoing basis. I may be dealing with a person that is extremely, they're down, way down deep in a deep hole. But I keep reminding myself that God specializes in taking folks in the deepest hole and bringing them up and bringing them out. I think that's the key right there.
Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of the podcast. Wanted to thank Pastor Kemp again for coming on to the show. Had a great conversation with him. Again, wanted to apologize for the technical issues that we had with the beginning of this podcast. There was about 6 minutes that were left out of the beginning. So again, I do apologize about that. I'm a one-man show, so I don't have the best technology, and sometimes I push the technology past their own limits. So if you would consider supporting the show by liking or following the podcast on whichever platform you're on, whether that be Apple, Facebook, Spotify, or even YouTube, it greatly helps us out a ton. Thank you all again for listening to this podcast. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.